The thin crackle of static filled the command tent at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal as Private First Class Thomas Begay adjusted his headset on the morning of August 12, 1942. Outside, the tropical heat shimmered over the muddy airstrip where Marine corsairs sat waiting for their next sortie. Begay, a 21-year-old Navajo from Arizona, had been told his language would be unbreakable, that the enemy listening posts scattered across the Solomon Islands would never decipher what he transmitted. What he did not yet understand was how profoundly right that assessment would prove to be, or how a single moment of improvisation would transform confusion into a weapon more devastating than any bomb in the American arsenal. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. By the time the sun set 3 weeks later, Begay's accidental genius would cost the Japanese military command 200 bombs, countless hours of planning, and the complete erosion of their confidence in their own intelligence networks. What began as a simple miscommunication would become a masterclass in psychological warfare, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from what you say clearly, but from what your enemy thinks they heard. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood in the communications room of the Japanese listening post on Bougainville Island, staring at the transcript his best cryptanalysts had just handed him. For 6 months, since the Americans had landed at Guadalcanal, his team had been intercepting radio transmissions in a language that defied every attempt at translation. Not even the linguistics professors brought from Tokyo Imperial University could make sense of it. The sounds seemed human, the patterns suggested syntax, but the meaning remained completely opaque. Yamamoto had studied at Stanford before the conflict began. He spoke English fluently and understood American military doctrine. He knew the Americans used call signs, coordinates, and standardized reporting procedures. But these transmissions followed none of those patterns. His superiors in Rabaul were growing impatient. Every day, American positions strengthened while Japanese forces waited for intelligence that never materialized into useful information. The listening post on Bougainville was one of 12 such facilities the Japanese had established throughout the Solomon Islands. Each was staffed by specially trained radio operators and cryptanalysts whose job was to intercept and decode enemy communications. The equipment was sophisticated, much of it imported from Germany before the conflict escalated. The analysts were among the best in the Japanese military, men who had cracked British and Chinese codes earlier in the war. Yet this particular challenge had them completely stumped. On this particular morning, Yamamoto's radio operators picked up an extended transmission that seemed different from the usual traffic. One phrase repeated multiple times across a 10-minute broadcast. His operator, Corporal Sato, had transcribed it phonetically as best he could, something that sounded like Dibayazi. The phrase appeared 17 times in various contexts, always with what seemed like coordinates or location identifiers following it. Yamamoto called in Lieutenant Koji Tanaka, his best analyst. Tanaka had spent 3 years in the Philippines before the conflict and had a gift for recognizing linguistic patterns. Together, they listened to the recording again and again. The voice was clear, unhurried, methodically repeating this phrase followed by what sounded like numbers. Tanaka brought his considerable expertise to bear on the problem. He had studied linguistics at Kyoto University and had published papers on code-breaking methodology. His analytical approach was systematic and thorough. He began by cataloging every instance of the mysterious phrase, noting the time of transmission, the apparent context, and any associated data. He created detailed charts showing frequency distributions and potential correlations with known American military activities. What struck Tanaka most was the consistency. Unlike random radio chatter or even encrypted messages that might show statistical variations, these transmissions had a rhythmic quality that suggested genuine language rather than code. The phonetic patterns repeated with the kind of regularity that linguists associate with natural speech. This led him to a conclusion that would prove both correct and catastrophically misleading. They were dealing with an actual language, not an artificial cipher. Tanaka suggested they might be dealing with a Native American language, something he had read about in anthropology journals. The Americans, he explained, had dozens of indigenous tribes with completely unrelated language families. If the military had recruited speakers of one of these languages as radio operators, conventional cryptanalysis would be useless. You cannot break a code that is not a code but rather an entirely different linguistic system. What neither of them knew was that the transmission they were analyzing so carefully had nothing to do with military operations. Thomas Begay had been transmitting routine weather reports and supply requests. The phrase they fixated on, Dibe Yazi, was simply the Navajo word for sheep. Begay had been describing the livestock situation at a rear area supply depot, relaying a request from the quartermaster for more mutton to feed the troops. The Navajo code had been developed earlier that year by Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran who had grown up on a Navajo reservation as the son of missionaries. Johnston understood that Navajo was an incredibly complex language, with tonal qualities and grammatical structures completely unlike any European or Asian language. He had proposed using Navajo speakers for secure communications, arguing that the language's obscurity and complexity made it effectively unbreakable without prior knowledge. The Marine Corps had embraced the idea enthusiastically. The first 29 Navajo recruits had been brought to Camp Elliott in California, where they developed a specialized vocabulary that mapped military terms onto Navajo words. A battleship was Lotso, which meant whale. A submarine was Beshlo, meaning ironfish. Fighter planes became Dahetihi, or hummingbird. These mappings were logical within Navajo cultural context, but completely opaque to anyone outside the Code Talker program. In Navajo culture, sheep held tremendous importance. They were a primary source of wealth, food, and wool for weaving. Families measured their prosperity in sheep. Children grew up herding them. The entire economy of reservation life, especially in the more traditional areas, revolved around sheep husbandry. So when the Code Talkers needed words for various supply categories and logistics functions, they naturally drew from familiar concepts. Different animals represented different supply types, with sheep indicating food supplies, particularly meat rations. But Yamamoto did not know this. What he saw was a mysterious phrase repeated 17 times with apparent coordinate data. His mind, trained to find patterns and threats, began constructing an elaborate interpretation. Perhaps Dibe Yazi was a code name for a military operation. Perhaps the coordinates indicated multiple targets. The repetitions suggested emphasis, importance, urgency. He drafted a report to Admiral Kusaka at Rabol headquarters. In it, he outlined his theory that the Americans were planning a significant operation, possibly a coordinated strike involving multiple locations. The mysterious phrase appeared to be the operational code name. His confidence grew as he wrote, "This was exactly the kind of intelligence breakthrough his superiors had been demanding." For months he had been sending reports that essentially admitted failure to understand enemy communications. Now, finally, he had something concrete to offer, a pattern that demanded action. The report was detailed and professional. Yamamoto included transcripts of the intercepted transmissions, his phonetic interpretation of key phrases, and a map showing all the locations mentioned in conjunction with the target phrase. He acknowledged the limitations of his analysis, noting that without understanding the language itself, he was working with circumstantial evidence. But he argued that the pattern was too consistent to ignore, that the Americans were clearly planning something significant, and that prudence demanded a military response. 3 days later, Yamamoto received orders that both validated and terrified him. Admiral Kusaka had taken his analysis seriously, very seriously. The High Command was authorizing a major redeployment of forces based on his intelligence assessment. Bomber squadrons would be redirected. Naval patrols would be intensified around the coordinates he had identified. The mysterious operation would be countered with overwhelming force before it could be launched. Yamamoto felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. Pride because his analysis had been deemed valuable enough to justify significant military action. Anxiety because he knew his conclusions were based on incomplete information and considerable speculation. What if he was wrong? What if this phrase meant something completely different? The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. Men would fly dangerous missions based on his report. Resources would be committed. Lives might be lost. all because he thought he had found a pattern in radio static. Meanwhile, at Henderson Field, Thomas Begay continued his routine duties, completely unaware that his weather reports had triggered a strategic panic hundreds of kilometers away. His role was simple and unglamorous. He translated messages from English to Navajo for transmission, then translated incoming Navajo transmissions back to English for the battalion commander. Most of his work involved logistics, supply requests, weather updates, and routine position reports. Begay had volunteered for military service in February of 1942, shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had been working on his family's ranch in Arizona when he heard about the recruitment effort for Navajo speakers. The idea of using his language to serve his country appealed to him. On the reservation, English was the language of schools and government, but Navajo remained the language of home, family, and tradition. Now suddenly, his native tongue was valuable to the military. The training had been intense. Basic military instruction was followed by specialized communications training and memorization of the code vocabulary. Begay had to learn not just the standard military terms translated into Navajo, but also the specific protocols for radio operation and message handling. He had to be able to transmit clearly under stress, to maintain radio discipline even during combat, and to switch seamlessly between English and Navajo as circumstances required. He had seen combat when the Japanese launched their major offensive in October, and his voice had remained steady even as artillery shells burst close to the communications bunker. But that was months ago. Now, in February of 1943, the front had stabilized, and his days were filled with the tedious but necessary work of keeping information flowing. He transmitted weather data so pilots would know flying conditions. He relayed supply requests so forward units would have ammunition and food. He confirmed troop positions so commanders could coordinate movements. It was unglamorous work, but it was essential. On February 15th, Begay transmitted another routine message that happened to include the word Diaries 3 times. He was updating the status of food supplies across several rear echelon positions. The word appeared in the context of confirming deliveries and requesting additional shipments. To Begay, this was as mundane as checking boxes on a form. To Lieutenant Tanaka, listening from Bougainville, it was confirmation that the mysterious operation was entering a new phase. Tanaka had spent 2 weeks analyzing every transmission containing the target phrase. He had created elaborate charts showing frequency patterns, time distributions, and apparent geographic correlations. His office wall was covered with maps marked with pins and colored strings connecting various intercept locations. To any objective observer, it would have looked like the work of a brilliant analyst uncovering a complex military plan. In reality, it was a masterpiece of self-deception, a monument to the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. On the morning of February 17th, bomber squadrons took off from airfields at Rabaul and Buka. Their targets were small islands and coastal positions that Tanaka had identified as probable staging areas for the American operation. These locations were based on coordinate data that appeared frequently in transmissions containing the key phrase. What the Japanese did not realize was that these coordinates referred to weather observation posts, supply depots, and administrative centers, places with no combat troops and minimal strategic value. The bombing campaign lasted 4 days. Wave after wave of aircraft dropped their payloads on empty beaches, abandoned buildings, and uninhabited jungle. The pilots flew their missions with professional dedication, believing they were striking crucial enemy installations. The bombardiers aimed carefully, ensuring their bombs hit the designated coordinates. The mission planners reviewed reconnaissance photographs and adjusted targeting as needed. Every aspect of the operation was executed with precision and competence. The tiny island of Mono received 37 bombs, destroying nothing more significant than coconut trees and frightening wildlife. The explosions carved craters in the sandy soil and sent fragments of coral flying through the air. The noise was tremendous, echoing across the water and rattling the windows of observation posts kilometers away. But when the smoke cleared, there were no destroyed fortifications, no burning supply dumps, no evidence of military damage because there had been no military targets to destroy. A coastal supply depot on the Russell Islands, which had already been evacuated weeks earlier, was hit with 42 bombs, cratering earth that contained only rusted equipment and empty supply crates. The depot had been a temporary facility used during the initial stages of the Guadalcanal campaign. Its supplies had long since been moved forward or redistributed to other locations. What remained were the physical remnants of past operations: empty tents, broken crates, abandoned tools. The bombing reduced this debris to even smaller pieces, but accomplished nothing of military significance. A weather station on Savo Island, staffed by 3 men who fled into the jungle at the first sound of approaching aircraft, was thoroughly obliterated by 28 bombs. The station consisted of a small wooden building housing meteorological instruments and a radio transmitter. The 3 weathermen had been tracking storm patterns and transmitting daily reports. When they heard the aircraft engines, they grabbed their emergency supplies and ran. They watched from a safe distance as their workplace was systematically destroyed, wondering what they could possibly have done to merit such attention. In total, over 200 bombs were dropped on targets that the Japanese High Command believed were critical to the mysterious American operation. Pilots returned reporting accomplishments against military installations. Intelligence officers congratulated themselves on preempting a major enemy offensive. Admiral Kusaka sent a commendation to Commander Yamamoto for his excellent analysis. The entire operation was considered a triumph of intelligence work and rapid military response. The Americans, watching from radar stations and observation posts, were utterly baffled. Why was Japan wasting precious aviation fuel and munitions to bomb empty islands and abandoned supply dumps? Intelligence officers at Henderson Field drafted urgent reports trying to understand the strategic logic. Was this a diversion? Were the Japanese trying to draw American forces into a trap? Was there some significance to these locations that American planners had missed? Lieutenant Colonel James Hawkins, the intelligence chief for the 1st Marine Division, held a briefing on February 22nd to discuss the mysterious bombing campaign. Present were signals intelligence officers, tactical air coordinators, and a young anthropology graduate named Sarah Mitchell, who had been recruited to help understand native cultures in the Pacific Theater. Hawkins spread the maps across the table, showing the pattern of Japanese attacks. Every target was a location that had been mentioned in recent radio traffic. Mitchell, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly asked a question that would unravel the entire mystery. "Who has been doing our Navajo transmissions in the past 2 weeks?" she asked. The signals officer checked his roster. Private Begay has been on primary rotation. Why? Mitchell asked to see transcripts of recent Navajo transmissions translated into English. As she read through them, her expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief to barely contained amusement. She pointed to a series of routine supply reports, weather updates, and administrative messages. In multiple transmissions, Begay had used the Navajo word for sheep when describing food supply categories and ration distributions. "They are bombing our sheep," Mitchell said, struggling to maintain her professional composure. "Or rather, they think we are planning some kind of operation related to livestock. These are supply reports about mutton rations. That is it. That is the entire mystery. Private Begay told them we needed more sheep, and they interpreted it as a military code name." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Then someone started laughing. Within seconds, the entire briefing room dissolved into laughter that mixed relief, amazement, and genuine respect for the sheer absurdity of the situation. The Japanese military, with all its sophisticated intelligence apparatus, had been chasing sheep across the Solomon Islands. But Colonel Hawkins was not laughing. His mind was already racing ahead to the strategic implications. If a single word in Navajo could trigger this kind of response, what would happen if they deliberately fed the Japanese misleading information? What if they turned the enemy's inability to understand Navajo into a systematic weapon? The accidental deception could become an intentional strategy. Within a week, Hawkins had drafted a classified memo that went directly to Admiral William Halsey, the overall commander of South Pacific Forces. The memo outlined a proposal for what would later be called Operation Woolly, a psychological warfare campaign designed to exploit Japanese paranoia about Navajo transmissions. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: use routine radio traffic to plant false information, knowing that Japanese intelligence would intercept it, fail to translate it, but still attempt to analyze patterns and respond to perceived threats. Thomas Begay learned about his accidental contribution during a briefing in early March. When the intelligence officer explained what had happened, Begay's reaction was characteristically understated. "So they attacked sheep," he said quietly. "My grandfather would find that funny. He always said sheep were the most valuable thing a man could own. I guess the Japanese generals agreed." But the story did not end with laughter. Operation Woolly became one of the most productive deception campaigns in the Pacific Theater. Over the next 6 months, Navajo code talkers deliberately included certain words and phrases in their transmissions, knowing they would be intercepted and misinterpreted. The word for potato triggered a Japanese reinforcement of their western positions, pulling troops away from the actual target of the next American offensive. The phrase for iron fish, which meant submarine in the Navajo code, caused a panic about underwater mines that never existed, leading to delays in Japanese naval movements. The psychological impact was profound and far-reaching. Japanese intelligence officers became increasingly paranoid about the mysterious language they could not break. Resources were diverted to linguistic analysis that went nowhere. Operational decisions were delayed while commanders waited for clarity that never came. The very presence of Navajo transmissions, regardless of content, became a source of anxiety and confusion. Commander Yamamoto, whose initial analysis had triggered the sheep bombing incident, was reassigned to a staff position in Tokyo. His final report from Bougainville was a masterpiece of analytical honesty. He wrote that the Americans had developed a communications system that was not only unbreakable, but weaponized through its opacity. The enemy, he explained, had turned their inability to be understood into a strategic advantage. Every attempt to analyze their transmissions led to false conclusions. Every response to apparent patterns played into American hands. The only winning move was not to play. But that meant accepting complete blindness to enemy communications, an impossibility in modern warfare. Lieutenant Tanaka continued his analytical work, but his confidence was shattered. He filled notebooks with linguistic theories and pattern analyses, but now every conclusion was hedged with doubt. Had he found a real pattern, or was he chasing another phantom sheep? The uncertainty paralyzed him. His reports became longer, more tentative, less useful. By August, he had been transferred to logistics, his analytical career effectively over. Thomas Begay served throughout the war, participating in operations across the Pacific. He transmitted coordinates during the Bougainville landings, relayed tactical information during the Battle of Guam, and coordinated communications during the invasion of Iwo Jima. His voice, speaking his native language, became part of the invisible infrastructure that allowed American forces to coordinate complex operations while denying that same capability to the enemy. But he always remembered the sheep incident with a certain bemused pride. Years later, when historians interviewed him about his service, he would describe it as the perfect military operation. Maximum enemy confusion achieved with 0 American casualties and minimal resource expenditure. "We did not fire a single shot," he would say, "but we made them waste 200 bombs attacking nothing. In war, making your enemy hurt themselves is better than hurting them yourself." The broader impact of the Navajo code talkers extended far beyond individual incidents. By the war's end, over 400 Navajo men had served in the program, transmitting thousands of communications that were never deciphered by enemy intelligence. The code they used was both simple and unbreakable, not because it was mathematically complex, but because it was based on a language that fewer than 30 non-Navajos outside the tribe could speak, and none of them worked for Japan. The sheep bombing incident became legendary within the code talker community, a story told and retold with variations and embellishments. Some versions had the Japanese dropping 1,000 bombs. Others claimed entire divisions were redeployed. The truth was remarkable enough without exaggeration. A routine transmission about food supplies had been misinterpreted as a major military operation, leading to a sustained bombing campaign against empty islands, wasting resources and eroding enemy confidence in their own intelligence capabilities. The incident also revealed something profound about the nature of intelligence work and the dangers of over-analysis. Yamamoto and Tanaka were not incompetent officers. They were educated, experienced professionals doing their best with limited information. Their mistake was not in being unintelligent, but in being too clever, in constructing elaborate theories to explain data that required no explanation. They saw patterns that did not exist, because their minds, like all human minds, were wired to find meaning in noise. This cognitive bias, the tendency to see significance in randomness, is what made the Navajo code talkers so effective. The Japanese were not uninformed for failing to break the code. They were victims of their own analytical sophistication, their belief that if they just tried harder, thought deeper, analyzed more carefully, they would find the pattern. But there was no pattern to find, just a language describing sheep. After the war, Thomas Bigay returned to Arizona. He worked as a teacher on the Navajo reservation, helping to preserve the language that had served his country so well. He rarely spoke about his military service, partly because the Code Talker program remained classified until 1968, but also because he was a humble man who saw his contribution as simply doing his duty. In 1982, the Navajo Code Talkers were finally recognized with a special commendation from President Ronald Reagan. Bigay attended the ceremony in Washington, one of dozens of aging veterans receiving the honor they had waited decades to accept. During the reception, a journalist asked him what he considered his most important contribution to the war effort. Bigay thought for a moment, then smiled. "I told people where the sheep were," he said, "and somehow that helped us win." The journalist looked confused, but the other code talkers in the room understood. They had all heard the story. Some had been part of Operation Woolly, deliberately feeding the enemy information designed to confuse and mislead. They had all experienced the strange power that came from speaking a language the enemy could not understand, and they had all seen how that incomprehension could be weaponized. The sheep bombing incident stands as a unique moment in military history, a case where miscommunication became a strategic weapon, where the enemy's inability to understand was more valuable than any information deliberately concealed. It demonstrated that in warfare, sometimes the best code is not the most complex encryption, but simply a language the enemy does not know exists. It also serves as a reminder that intelligence analysis is as much art as science, that even the most sophisticated analytical methods can lead to absurd conclusions when applied to data that does not mean what you think it means. Yamamoto and Tanaka were not fools. They were victims of a situation where their greatest strengths, their analytical rigor and determination to find patterns, became weaknesses when applied to information that was exactly what it appeared to be, a simple statement about sheep. For the Navajo Code Talkers, the incident validated their role in a way that no military commendation could match. They were not just transmitting information. They were warriors, fighting with weapons the enemy could not even recognize as weapons. Their language, the language of their ancestors, the language that government schools had once tried to erase, had become a shield protecting American lives and a sword striking at enemy confidence. The irony was not lost on the Code Talkers themselves. Many of them had attended government boarding schools where speaking Navajo was forbidden, where children were punished for using their native language. They had been told that English was the language of civilization and progress, that their traditional tongue had no place in the modern world. Now that supposedly obsolete language was helping to win the most modern and technological war in human history. Thomas Bigay died in 2003 at the age of 82. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in World War II but did not detail his role as a code talker. That information was by then public knowledge, but Bigay had never sought attention. His family knew some of the stories, including the one about the sheep, but many details remained private. He had been a quiet man who believed that actions spoke louder than words, even though his words spoken in Navajo across radio waves had spoken volumes to those who needed to hear them. The legacy of the Code Talkers extends beyond their military accomplishments. They proved that indigenous languages and cultures, often dismissed or suppressed, had practical value in the modern world. They demonstrated that diversity in communication could be a strategic advantage. that having people who could speak multiple languages and move between different cultural frameworks was not just nice to have, but essential for national security. The sheep incident, humorous as it seems in retrospect, illustrates a deeper truth about warfare and human cognition. We are pattern-seeking creatures, constantly trying to make sense of the information around us. This ability has allowed humanity to thrive, to predict events and plan for contingencies, but it also makes us vulnerable to seeing patterns that do not exist, to constructing elaborate explanations for simple events, to mistaking sheep for military operations. In the specific context of World War II in the Pacific, this incident was a minor footnote in a vast conflict that reshaped the world. 200 bombs dropped on empty islands was insignificant compared to the massive campaigns that characterized the war. But for the individuals involved, it was a moment that revealed the strange logic of warfare, where a word about livestock could trigger a military response, where confusion could be as powerful as ammunition, where speaking your native language could help defeat an empire. The incident also highlighted the importance of cultural knowledge in intelligence work. The Japanese analysts were technically proficient, but they lacked the cultural context to understand what they were hearing. They knew American military doctrine, but they did not know about Navajo culture, reservation life, or the importance of sheep in traditional economy. This gap in cultural understanding proved more significant than any technological advantage. In modern military thinking, the sheep incident is studied as an example of how cognitive biases affect intelligence analysis. Military academies use it to teach officers about the dangers of confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret ambiguous information in ways that confirm existing hypotheses. Yamamoto had a theory about a major operation, and every subsequent transmission seemed to confirm that theory, even though the actual content was mundane. The story has also found its way into popular culture. Several books about the Code Talkers mention the incident, though often with varying levels of accuracy. Some versions exaggerate the number of bombs dropped or the strategic impact. Others focus on the human element, the image of confused Japanese generals trying to decipher messages about sheep. The core truth remains remarkable. A miscommunication about livestock led to a multi-day bombing campaign against empty targets. For the Navajo Nation, the Code Talker story represents a proud moment in tribal history. The Code Talkers demonstrated that traditional language and culture could contribute to the broader American society, that indigenous knowledge had value beyond the reservation. Many Navajo families have Code Talker veterans among their ancestors, and the story is passed down through generations as an example of how their people served and contributed. The sheep incident, specifically, has become part of Navajo oral tradition. Elders tell it to children as both a humorous anecdote and a lesson about the power of language. The story reinforces cultural pride while acknowledging the absurdity of war. It shows that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not guns or bombs, but words that others cannot understand. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.